Roboute Guilliman was the first Primarch to return to the setting, and he actually made it back to Terra to speak with his father after a long, tumultuous journey. However, when he met the Emperor, it really shocked the community because his response was pretty cold. In Dark Imperium, Guilliman's thoughts are actually around how the Emperor doesn't really love him, doesn't love any of his sons, doesn't really love any part of humanity. And he says that the Emperor can't really afford to. The Emperor has to be practical about his actions. And this, of course, has really undercut this idea that the Emperor is this wonderful, loving being. And in fact, most people believe he's just this brutal, ruthless figure in the setting. However, now that we've had The End and the Death Volume 2, it looks like we finally have a reason as to why the Emperor is like this. Why he never seems to show any love for his sons. We do actually see bits of the conversation Guilliman has with the Emperor in the book Godblight, and the Emperor is incredibly harsh to his son. He calls him thief, he calls him betrayer, but he also calls him his last hope. One of the big revelations in The End and the Death Volume 2 is that the Emperor's soul is split into two. And we actually see this happen from Malcador the Sigillite, who is soon to become Malcador the Hero. At this point in the book, Malcador has just seen the Emperor have a long conversation with a Lanius person, and Lanius's role in the book is to convince the Emperor not to ascend to godhood, because if he ascends to godhood, he'll become this character called the Dark King, and humanity will burn in the Birthfire. So Lanius has the Emperor analyze his plan using his new godly powers, and the Emperor comes to the conclusion, the rightful conclusion, that if he ascends to godhood, all will be lost anyway, the Chaos Gods will already win, the warp will rage for millions of years, and humanity will suffer and essentially be completely destroyed. So the Emperor decides to let go of his godhood, let go of all of his power. However, unknown to everybody but Malcador, the Emperor lets go of a part of his soul.
For my King of Ages has done more than divest himself of godhood. In that shockwave of warplight, I saw something else, something perhaps only I was in a position to see. He cast aside a fragment of himself. My lord and friend has broken off a part of his soul. He has amputated that portion of himself that contains almost all of his hope, loyalty, and compassion, for such things will become a hindrance when he faces the Lupercal. Those qualities might make him stay his hand, or make him hesitate if he is ultimately obliged to kill. And if he is obliged to kill his son, then those qualities would afterwards and inevitably drive him to self-hatred and regret, and condemn him to the same embittered path as Horus. He has excised those precious human aspects to further steel himself against the pain of what will come after, and the mandatory atrocities he will have to countenance in order to rebuild the Imperium. He has set those frail and cardinal virtues adrift on the tides of the Imperium so that they will not immobilize him, and in the hope that one day he will be able to reclaim them and be whole again. I watch the jettisoned fragment as it drifts into the void, just one more spark from this world bonfire. All his hope, his mercy, his grace, his love cast into the lightless tracks of space and time. The fragile asterism will, as cosmic ages turn, slowly grow by a coalescence of emotion and belief, just as the powers of chaos grow. It luminesces briefly, just as a speck of hermetic fire against the shrouded pinpricks of the Milky Way, like an infant sun or a child star. And then it is gone and lost from view.
And so it was that the Emperor of Mankind made perhaps the greatest sacrifice we could possibly imagine for us all. He realized that he couldn't bring himself to kill his son as things stood, and he knew what must be done. He knew that Horus Lupercal must be defeated. So he abandoned the parts of his soul connected to love and hope and loyalty. And he did this for two reasons. There's so much in that passage to unpack. The first was because he knew that he might hesitate fighting against Horus. But the second was because he knew that if he could kill Horus, if he defeated his son, the fact that he would have to countenance the many necessary atrocities of the Imperium of Man, and the fact that he'd have to live with the fact that his son, who he loved, fell to chaos and had to be brought down by his own hand, all of this would mean that the Emperor would eventually be damned himself over the many thousands of years that he would watch over the Imperium of Man. And so when Rabute Guilliman returns to the setting in Warhammer 40K, and he talks about how brutal the Emperor is, how the Emperor has no love for him, no love for any of his sons, no love for any of humanity, he's dead on the money. None of us knew really just how accurate Guilliman was in that assessment, because it is true to say that the Emperor has no love for any of his sons anymore, whilst he sits on the Golden Throne, because that love is gone. But where has it gone? And that is the main thing I wanted to talk about today. Because again, if we have a look at that passage, there's a couple of things that are specifically mentioned by Malcador, and I can't help but think this is Dan Abnett winking at the camera, being very direct and very clear that this is the future of Warhammer 40k. This will be the trajectory of the storyline. So the first thing he says is that over the thousands of years that come, this second part of the Emperor's soul that's been jettisoned into the warp will grow, and it will continue to flourish and be able to help humanity and impact reality just as the Chaos Gods can, and it will grow in the same way that they grow. So whereas Nurgle is empowered by decay and despair, the Emperor will be empowered by the love of the citizens of the Imperium, by the worship of the Imperial Creed. And so now we have it confirmed basically in the lore that there are two parts of the Emperor. We have the Emperor on the Golden Throne, this brutal, rigid part, and we have this part of the Emperor that contains all of his love and loyalty, and that is the part that is affecting the Imperium. And especially since the Psychic Awakening and the opening of the Great Rift, we've seen the Emperor have a greater impact in Warhammer 40k, and Guilliman himself has had to address this. Guilliman keeps hearing reports of people claiming that they've met the Emperor, that the Emperor has told them what to do. Guilliman himself has met a saint in the book Plague War, the second book of the Dark Imperium trilogy. He does meet a saint. In the third book of the Dark Imperium trilogy, he has a conversation with a librarian and Ilian Natase, a member of the All-the-Way Craft world, about this idea of, is my father a god? Because things are getting weird. Everyone thinks he's a god. Guilliman can't help but wonder, is this affecting him? Everyone believes he's a god, and everyone believing the Emperor is a god is having a real effect. So it's really messing with his head. He reads the Lectitio Divinitatis and kind of analyzes it, the book that Lorgar himself wrote. Things are getting a bit nuts in the 40k timeline. And the main book that kind of covers this is a book called Throne of Light from the Dawn of Fire series. It's also mentioned in the following book. There's like a throwaway line about a character sees a burning throne wreathed in flames, 8 terrible shadows, their long skeletal hands reaching out to crush the holy light of the God Emperor. Golden eyes opening in the face of a child filled with ancient knowledge. However, it's actually in the previous book that we get most of the talk about the Starchild. And this is not a subtle introduction, it's pretty strong. There's actually a chapter on the Starchild in the epilogue that I'm going to go through now. But it's worth noting that throughout the book, Throne of Light, the word bearers are genuinely quite scared. So characters like Corpheron even. So the Chaos Gods are clearly very aware of this idea that there's a second part of the Emperor in the warp, and it might be reborn into a child. This will be called the Starchild, and that will be a huge threat to the Chaos Gods, and it could very well destroy them.
The greatest consequence of this psychic tumult was to occur at the heart of the Imperium itself. Certain sects of the ecclesiarchy began to preach that the Emperor was stirring, and their belief had some evidence to support it. As black as those days were, miracles abounded. On Toledos, the ghosts of the dead rose up. Imperial saints came to the aid of beleaguered armies. Readings of the Imperial Tarot made the difference between disaster and triumph, while reports of the mysterious Legion of the Damned became ever more frequent. Wherever Guilliman went, the warp storm stilled, allowing his armies to make rapid headway. A number of strange coincidences and odd phenomena reached the Primarch's ears. He discounted them at first, but as time went on, he was unable to do so, and became disquieted. All across the Imperium were people who claimed to have been visited or guided by the Emperor. Many of these were burned as heretics, but in other cases their words and presence provided succor to the desperate, and encouraged those who had no hope of salvation from other quarters to fight back against mankind's enemies. A few years after the crusade began, visions of a golden infant interspersed with those of a blindingly radiant being rising from a throne began to be reported across the astropathic network. Beginning in Segmentum Solar and confined at first to background noise, the sort of low-grade psychic interference churned up the currents of the warp. These visions became clearer and spread. Though their import was hotly debated, certain seers, both loyal and traitor, interpreted the visions as a possible sign of direct action by the God Emperor, leading to a great outpouring of faith on the Imperial side that was matched only by the enemy's dismay. Among the most heretical interpretations were parallels made with the insidious belief in the Starchild, promulgated by a cult which had been destroyed some years before the Great Rift. The news of these visions was to cause great upheaval within the Imperium, as many of the mighty suspected them to be a trick of the enemy, while others insisted they were of divine origin. The fractional nature of Imperial politics was complicated further as ideological lines were drawn, sometimes to be defended with violence. Still, others, more learned than most, and not all of them human, were deeply troubled by these supposed miracles. As a result, certain esoteric orders on both sides were spurred into action, desperate to learn the truth and exploit it before their enemies could, whatever that truth might be.
So in Throne of Light, we revisit this topic of the Starchild, and it wasn't an idea that was ever like retconned or anything like that, but it was certainly an idea in Warhammer 40k that hadn't been revisited for many years really, and people kind of thought it had been forgotten about and that Black Library had moved on from. So for example, it was always connected to, or often connected to, these characters called the Sensei, who were the trueborn sons and daughters of the Emperor, who were immortal beings who serve this kind of cult of the Starchild, etc. And so the fact that the Starchild is returning as a concept is really interesting, because now the question has to be asked, will the Sensei return to Warhammer 40k? Will we see more stuff like that? It's quite interesting. But in Throne of Light, this storyline is alive and well. So since the Great Rift, reports and visions of this child who will be reborn with this ancient knowledge and powers of the Emperor, they are widespread throughout the Segmentum Solar, spreading throughout the rest of the Imperium. The word bearers are particularly worried about this. They genuinely talk about this idea that if they don't tackle this prophecy of the Starchild and sort it out quickly, it could well mean the end of the Chaos Gods and all of their believers. That's how big a deal this is. So it is a massive worry for them in 40k. There's always been this comparison between Imperial Saints for the Emperor and demons and demon princes for the Chaos Gods. And one of the reasons for that is likely because now that we have this second part of the Emperor's soul in the warp, perhaps the Imperial Saints, people like Saint Celestine, act as his demons in reality. And they really are effective against fighting other demons. Faith in the Emperor is one of the most powerful tools that we see in the setting that normal humans can have when fighting against demons. It's phenomenally impactful. The fact that a part of the Emperor's soul survives in the warp is actually really important for your everyday citizens, because one of the most terrifying things about 40k, I've always thought, is the fact that death is horror. Your soul will be devoured by demons in the warp. And the fact that it was always said in the setting, hey, if you pray to the Emperor, if you're a great servant of the Imperium, then in your afterlife, the Emperor will protect your soul. That was always said, but actually, that was probably not going to happen, because you're just going to get devoured anyway. But now, maybe your soul can be saved by the Emperor, and it will be protected. So all those Imperial preachers are kind of right. They're kind of right in their preachings there. I think that the main thing Malcador tells us from that passage in terms to the future of Warhammer 40k is this idea that the Emperor did all of this and went through all of this suffering because there is a hope that one day the two parts of his soul will be reunited, the part that exists on the Golden Throne and the part that exists in the warp. And so when that happens, if you're someone that is hoping for the Emperor to one day get off the Golden Throne, I think that is the direction we're going to need to go. And I think that that is going to be kind of the ultimate storyline in Warhammer 40k now, being honest with you, because I think that that's what we're going to see Constantine VALDOR being focused around, unifying the two parts of the Emperor's soul. And I think that we're going to see that in the Starchild storyline, because there's going to be this child that's born that contains the reborn soul of the Emperor, etc. But that's not powerful enough, I think, on its own. I think we're going to have to see the Emperor properly reunited. I think it's a really good storyline for GW to go down, because there's a long progression here. I think we're going to start off going down this Starchild storyline, and we're going to have many books now around this cult of the Starchild, this idea that many people within the Imperium are looking for this child, and we're going to have many servants of chaos scared and looking to kill this child, and then that child will eventually be reborn. But that alone, I don't think is going to be enough. And in the long run, we're going to work towards this idea of reuniting the two parts of the Emperor's soul. My main theory with VALDOR is this idea that he is probably going to be working to try and combine the two parts of the Emperor's soul, because all of the other theories that we had before were around things like, oh, maybe he'll try and clear out the webway, or maybe he'll try and destroy enemies of the Emperor. But fundamentally, that Emperor that VALDOR knew and loved and served is gone. He doesn't exist anymore, because he's been split into two separate parts. So the question is, what would VALDOR do now? And I actually don't know. I actually don't know what he would do, but I think he's going to try and understand that and combine the two parts of his soul. And we do see in the Beckwin novel there's a strong presence of these beings called Grails, who are like positive warp entities, but they still kill people and they serve the King in Yellow. And he actually manages to basically put these souls into blanks, who are people without souls. And so I'm just can't help but wonder that is basically the plot of the Starchild, is putting the Emperor's soul into a child. And then that child would be reborn, or would be born with incredible knowledge and power. So what VALDOR's doing in the City of Dust right now works pretty well as a practice for creating the Starchild. That works for me. Another super chat. Thank you, Mr. Sandman. Hey, great name. Makes sense why the King in Yellow is searching for Big E's real name, possibly to bind the warp-bound half of Big E's soul. Yeah, Good point. Thank you so much for the super chat. I mean, yeah, that would totally work as well. So true names allow you to basically control warp entities in Warhammer 40K. We see that a few times, like as one of the reasons the Dark Angels used to torture Luther so much was to learn the true names of demons. Grey Knights can do it. That the Grey Knights' names like the antithesis of a demon name. So it comes up quite a bit. And this idea that if you learned the Emperor's true name, you could, in theory, control that part of the Emperor's soul that exists in the warp and has grown more and more powerful for thousands of years. If the King in Yellow did that, that would make him incredibly powerful. The other thing that's really interesting about that point there, mate, is that it also suggests that VALDOR knows this. And the reason that's important is because in that section of the End of Death Volume 2, it's heavily implied that only Malcador can see this. Malcador is the only person that knows officially that the Emperor's soul has been split into two. So the question has to be asked, will anybody else figure it out? Like, has VALDOR figured it out? And one of the things that I was really wondering about this week was, has Guilliman figured it out? Because as I was talking about earlier, in the Dark Imperium trilogy, in the first book, Guilliman talks about how the Emperor loves no one. He loves none of his sons. He loves no one in humanity. He's just purely practical and brutal in his ambitions. And he does serve humanity, but he doesn't really love any one thing. And then as we go through the trilogy, his attitude does seem to change. He starts having all these conversations about godhood. And at the end of the series, when we see the conversation that Guilliman has with the Emperor, it's interesting because up to this point, Guilliman couldn't actually remember the conversation. That's a nice little tidbit, is that Guilliman just couldn't remember anything his father had said to him because the psychic effects of communicating with the Emperor left you with some sort of amnesia, apparently. But when we do see that conversation, the Emperor does call Guilliman his last hope. He does talk about rebirth and apotheosis and all these things. And having read The End and the Death Volume 2 now, it's like, oh, maybe that's what these words are talking about. Maybe all of this is connecting. And so I can't help but wonder, has Guilliman figured it out? Has Guilliman guessed that the Emperor's soul has been split into two? Could VALDOR's goal be not to invade / reinforce the material realm, but go relive / take the Terran Gate and the Impossible City, thus relieving the gate and allowing the Golden Throne to be fixed gateway prepared? I think that's a perfectly valid plotline. The problem I have with it, though, is just that what purpose does that actually serve now? Because if the Webway Gate is cleared and the Emperor is no longer bound to stay on the Golden Throne, let's say they closed it. If that happened, the Emperor is still not going to be able to get off the Golden Throne and be the man he once was, because half his soul's missing. So I can't help but think that this is the other way to go. But it could well be something like that. I think that would be a perfectly reasonable goal. The number of hints in this passage are so on the nose. Dan Abnett talks about how this second part of the Emperor's soul is going to go into the warp and it will grow through a coalescence of emotion and belief, just like the Chaos Gods do. Is going to grow through the love, the loyalty of the Imperial citizen. He talks about how without being reunited with the second part of his soul, the Emperor's radiance is dimmed. The Emperor is a lot less powerful now than he was before. But there is this hope that one day the Emperor may be reunited with the second part of his soul. So I think that's more likely to be it. But yeah, sorry, I don't want to shoot that theory down. I think it's perfectly fine. I just kind of have my own theories. Just wanted to chip in that The End of the Death seems to be going down the route of everything you were told happened, and yet everything you know is wrong. I mean, it's one of those things where, because I thought about this the other day, if you have a look at your rulebook for Warhammer 40K, the lore for which has not changed, if you have a look at the Age of Darkness part, it says, it was the Emperor's first son, the War Master Horus of the Lunar Wolves Legion, who turned first. Now, when I read you that, your immediate response, I'm assuming, is to go, if you're a fan of 40K, that's not technically true. Horus is not the first son of the Emperor to turn against him. Lorgar is the first heretic. We find that out in the book First Heretic. So this is wrong. And this is the core book for Warhammer 40K. How can that be? Well, the answer is because this isn't the facts of Warhammer 40K. This is the mythology and the beliefs of the Imperium 10,000 years later. So everything being wrong, or a lot of things being wrong, kind of makes sense. Everything you know about the Horus Heresy up till now, as people are saying in the chat, is good point, is all Imperial propaganda. Lots of it is wrong. So like the biggest thing that the Ending of Death Volume 2 has changed, and I think it was quite a shock here, is to see that Sanguinius doesn't put a chink in Horus's armor at all in that book. He does nothing. He deals a bunch of damage, but then that's it. Time travel is coming and will play a part, I think. Gene Father mentions the Ordo Chronos. Yeah, I definitely think that time travel is coming, and I hope they exercise caution in how they use time travel. Yeah, it can ruin a setting. If they're going to use time travel, it needs to be cool to figure out something about the pylons, and something happens when he comes back and the technology is lost, so it can't happen again. Thanks, Anthony. There's two main ways we're going to see time travel in the very near future, almost certainly. So the first is John Grammaticus and Elenius Person, and the reason we're going to see that is because the Emperor, we believe, is probably he with the knife that Ol has, which allows him to travel through time. And the Ol and John's plan in the final book, it seems, is going to be to go back through time to create a causal loop to make sure they always end up in front of the Emperor every time. The other way is Vashdor and Abaddon, because, and people don't talk about this very much, but the device that Vashdor steals from the Rock is one of 3 devices, and they're like Old One's warp drives, and they are used in a book called The Unforgiven, a Dark Angels book, and they allow time travel. They allow you to go back to the destruction of Caliban. So potentially Vashdor's plan, we don't really know what like this key is and what the weapon is that he talks about. If you're not familiar, Vashdor talks about like a weapon and a key, and they're supposedly going to win the war and allow him to ascend to godhood, etc. We don't know what those are, but what if one of those things is lost in time, and so he needs this dissonance engine and these Old Ones devices to travel back through time in order to find them? What happened to the true sons of the Emperor, the Sensei? It's a good question. So the Sensei haven't properly been looked at in Warhammer 40k for a while as things are. We don't really like to say things have been retconned in 40k because typically Games Workshop and Black Library aren't so blunt just to say, oh, well, this is not a thing that is mentioned in Dawn of Fire, so therefore it's no longer lore. However, I will say in Throne of Light, there is this reference to storylines, old storylines from Warhammer 40k that the Sensei were connected to. So I do think there's a chance that we might see the Sensei return in some form. It was often thought that maybe the Perpetuals were Dan Abnett's replacement for the Sensei storyline, but we don't actually know. Maybe they will return in some form. But certainly it looks like the Starchild storyline is heavily set to return. You know, this idea that the Emperor is going to be reborn in Warhammer 40k, maybe with VALDOR's help, maybe with some of the Primarch's help, maybe Guilliman's going to become aware of it. And that is, I think, likely to become a major plot point in the future of Warhammer 40k. Malcador is pretty clear that the Emperor does hope that his soul is going to be reunited in the future, and potentially the Starchild is the way to do this. It would be a huge deal to have the Emperor kind of take form in the galaxy once again. It'd also be a pretty good way to have the Emperor return to Warhammer 40k and not end the setting. Because the problem is, if you unite the soul of the Emperor and he steps off the Golden Throne, he would be more powerful than ever before, and the setting would essentially end. But this Starchild storyline might work pretty well. So I guess we'll see. Certainly, it's really interesting to see the Servants of Chaos be so worried about Starchild returning, and the Chaos Gods are clearly very aware of this plan. This is like an older storyline from Warhammer 40K, and the cult of the Starchild had to be stamped out once before. That was referenced in Throne of Light as well. But now it looks like it's going to return, and there could be some sort of, minor civil wars that we'll see on planets throughout the Imperium, where you have, different sects of the ecclesiarchy. Some see the Starchild storyline as like pure heresy, and some see it as the future of humanity and the main redemption for the servants of the Emperor. Before I sign off, I will just say the winner for the giveaway for all of the books that I thought on the new Warhammer website, which has not been controversial to say the least. The winner was Bauerlein John, Bauerleinjohn. I'll tag it in the description as well of this video. So yes, if that is you, there's a link on the About page. So you can email me and I will sort out getting these books to you. Thank you so much to everyone that entered. I will try and do more giveaways in the future. Well done to you for winning, and thanks everybody for entering. Thank you to everyone who enjoys the stream. It makes my week to do these. I can't stress enough how much I really enjoy them. So thank you so much. Do let me know in the comments, etc., what kind of things you'd like me to cover in the future. I have a plan to release a lot of videos in December. So yeah, that's something that I've been working on for a little bit. Later this week, I have got a kind of a new type of content being released, something I've not done before. But I'll be interested to see what you guys think of it. And yeah, please give me a lot of feedback. I do really appreciate it. And I will see you all next time. So thank you so much for watching, and take care.